Hello, blogging heads. I'm Ross Douthat. I'm a columnist for the New York Times, and I'm here, if technology permits, with...
Dan Savage, and I am a bad, bad man.
Yeah, so I'm here representing the forces of reactionary Puritanism.
And I'm here representing the forces of reactionary onanism.
Excellent. So we've got basically all our bases covered in this discussion. But basically, I think the original impetus for this conversation was that Dan was the subject of a long and very interesting sort of intellectual profile in the New York Times Magazine about, God, it's been a month now or something, 2 months, some unknown length of time, and who knows when.
And the Republic still stands.
And the Republic still stands.
Yeah.
But this profile was about Dan's views on the role of monogamy in marriage, and sort of roving across issues having to do with how gay marriage may affect straight marriage, vice versa, sort of different models for marriage, and so on. And I, in my role as sort of reactionary scold, wrote a column.
Your words, not mine. Your words,
pivoting off this essay where basically I sort of talked about from a sort of socially conservative perspective, if we're going to have gay marriage in America, how should, what form should it take, what form should maybe social conservatives want it to take, and so on, and I sort of critiqued the idea that marriage as an institution can successfully accommodate, well, I guess you wouldn't call it infidelity exactly, because infidelity implies it's sort of not agreed to, but that marriage as an institution would have trouble successfully accommodating a sort of more open understanding of the role of monogamy.
And then you invoked key parties and the ice storm and cliche open marriages.
I invoked the 1970s. I don't know if I specifically mentioned, but yes, I invoked some of the, let's say, the social science evidence from
everybody always does, which is complete horseshit. But go ahead.
All right. Well, why don't we start with that, because that's, I think, from the point of view of sort of if you sort of bracket the issue of gay marriage and just look at sort of the story that I think a lot of heterosexuals tell about marriage in the United States, there's this sense that the period when heterosexual culture was sort of most accommodating of adultery, what have you, was also the period when marriages in the United States had the roughest time. And you think that's horseshit, so let's start. Why is it horseshit?
Well, first, when you say the period in which heterosexual culture was most accommodating of adultery, monogamy never really applied to men until about 50 or 60 years ago. Men had concubines and access to prostitutes and mistresses, and it wasn't until heterosexuals redefined marriage to be this Pharisees institution, in about the midpoint in the last century, that the monogamous expectation was imposed on men. So the 70s wasn't some sort of aberration where suddenly heterosexuals went, hey, we can have marriage without monogamy. Heterosexuals had marriage without monogamy for millennia until y'all fucked up when you decided to make marriage egalitarian, and instead of extending to women the same license and latitude that men had always enjoyed, you imposed on men the same limitations and aggravations that women had always endured, and it's been a disaster for marriage. Social conservatives always like to, point to the pill or the gay rights movement or the women's rights movement as this, as having these disastrous impacts upon marriage, because look at the correlation between the introduction of the pill and divorce. And I look at that and I see the imposition of monogamy correlating most strongly with divorce in the United States.
Okay, but so then what do you think about the sort of shift that's happened in, if you just look at sort of upper middle class, college educated Americans since the 1970s, you see you see three things. One is that a pretty egalitarian model of marriage pretty much persists over the last 30 or 40 years with some, hiccups, ups and downs, and so on. Over that same period, you have, if you look at sort of the numbers on people saying, is adultery always wrong, sometimes wrong, and so on, you have rising disapproval of adultery. And then you have falling divorce rates, not necessarily in society as a whole, but in the, most stable sort of college-educated cohort and so on. So is that cohort, I guess my cohort, are we just all kidding ourselves? Is there going to be a big sort of eruption of male lust, at least in the college-educated demographic any day now?
Well, I think in the college-educated demographic, there's more of an understanding that marriage is what the two people in any particular marriage say that it is. When we hear from social conservatives that marriage is defined by monogamy or the presence of children or faith, that's only true somehow when gay people want to get married. Heterosexuals, particularly college-educated heterosexuals, are acutely aware that you don't have to be monogamous to be married or married to be monogamous. Children are optional. Marriage can be a religious R-I-T-E or a civil R-I-G-H-T. And it can be for life or not. And under those sorts of circumstances, for those people, I'm not saying that monogamy for many people isn't very important, and for them as a couple, a defining characteristic of their marriage. But they realize it is optional. And over the multi-decade course of a marriage, that there may be an incident, there may be an infidelity, there may be an adultery, there may be a shift or a change. A marriage now being about love, which itself was a redefinition of the institution of marriage. Love changes and shifts over time. And a relationship that for the first 10 or 20 or 30 years, if you're lucky, that's about sex and sexual passion, may become about something else or something more and more transcendent than just erections and orgasms later in life. And I think even your college
and as it becomes more transcendent, you'll start finding those erections and orgasms somewhere else and just coming home for the transcendence.
Perhaps. When it comes to this debate, it always comes down to, people are imagining these best of all possible worlds marriages that are going to be destabilized by adultery. And the point I make, and I made and Mark made for me in the piece he wrote for the New York Times Magazine, is there are times when I'm not trying to impose non-monogamy on all couples. I don't think that's your job. That's your axe to grind. You think all couples should be monogamous, and I think all couples should be whatever works for them. And for many, 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 I'm willing to concede, monogamy is what works, at least for the first 10, 20, 30, 40 years. But I deal with real-world situations and have for 20 years writing my column. You get letters from people who, monogamy totally worked for 25 years. Now their partner is chronically ill, is no longer capable of having sex. And the person who, isn't ill is staying by them, is staying with them, and is also kind of going out of their minds because of the sexual deprivation. What should that person do in that situation? I think in that situation, an infidelity is the lesser offense than a divorce.
Right. Well, all right. So there are a lot of places we could take this, but let's start with this question. What do you think is the sort of societal purpose of an institution, right? Like the idea of an institution. I mean, because what you've just described to me, this sort of idea that marriage should be whatever the partners make of it.
I'm not saying that's what marriage should be. That's what marriage is.
Right.
Marriage is what the two people who are married to each other say that it is. It can be monogamous or not, for life or not, religious or not, children or not. It is entirely up to that couple. We've only suddenly started
So essentially, you're proposing a definition of marriage that is essentially empty until it is filled by whatever the particular couple seeks to do. Because look, I mean, if you look at American society as a whole, yes, it is true that you can find every single potential kind of marriage in America. Right? There are 300 million people in the country.
I'm not proposing a definition of marriage.
Sorry, go ahead, Dan.
I'm not proposing some crazy new definition of marriage. I'm looking at marriage as straight people practice it and have defined it and saying, this is what it is. This is what you guys are doing.
No, but there's a distinction between saying that, as straight people actually practice marriage, there are 16,000 different ways it's practiced, but also saying that most straight people enter into marriages with a particular set of cultural expectations, right, which are created by the institution, or by the sort of history and practice of the institution, right?
I concur.
Okay, so but you're saying that you think even now there are, in a sense, too many expectations associated with the institution, right? That people are coming into this institution and they feel like, well, there's an expectation that I have to be monogamous even if my partner is unable to perform sexually for 15 years, and that those kind of expectations need to be sort of eased away in the same way that, say, the expectation that a wife would just give her husband her property has been eased away.
I'm not saying they should be eased away. I'm saying that we should be conscious of them, and we should talk about them. I believe that if more people who are incapable of monogamy would be honest about it, we would have fewer people who are incapable of lifelong monogamy, marrying people that value lifelong monogamy. I want to see more sorting, self-sorting, where you don't have Wieners marrying non-Wieners and Clintons marrying Rodhams and then having crack-ups and disasters.
Okay, but don't you think that there are? I'm sorry to keep just posing questions to you, but don't you think that there is also a sense in which it isn't always the worst thing in the world if the guy who's a rake in his 20s, finds a girl who has higher expectations of him, and he spends the marriage trying to live up to those expectations, right? No, I mean, there has to be, you can't just say, well, we all need to find our sort of moral lowest common denominator and live with that, right?
There's an implicit value judgment of lowest common denominator in this friends, but no, I can see that.
Listen, I'm sorry. Maybe you forget. My value judgments are explicit. They're not. They're not implicit.
I agree with you there. I have said that when you meet and date and mate and potentially hook up for life or marry if that's an option available to you. You are a long-term relationship is a lie that two people tell each other. It's a myth that they create each other. You present your best self when you're dating and mating and proposing, and then you spend the rest of your married life trying to live up to that lie that you told the person that you conned into partnering with you.
Okay, but why is it a lie to say maybe you presented an aspirational self?
Okay,
right. So it's less a lie than you presented a standard that being human you're not going to necessarily live up to.
Right, you're a Potemkin person.
Well, I mean, it seems like you have a rather low opinion of sort of. I mean, understandably, I suppose I have a low opinion of human beings too, in a way. But
I spend all day reading emails from people who've made a hash of their personal lives and their relationships.
But do you ever worry that your sort of your livelihood as a sex columnist might sometimes give you a somewhat skewed view of sort of the state of sex in America?
I'm 100% willing to admit that my sample is hopelessly skewed. My sample is bent over the couch getting the hell skewed out of it all day long. But those are the people for whom your model doesn't work, and I want to help those people find a way to have love in their lives, have a commitment in their lives that work for them, even if that means having a monogamous commitment that works for them. I don't just sit here and hand out permission slips and say, yeah, go fuck whatever you want to fuck. I believe people should honor the commitments that they make, and including a monogamous commitment, if they've made one. I just don't believe that it's wise necessarily to encourage people to make commitments that they as individuals, not as males or females or a species, are incapable of living up to. People have to know themselves. And I also believe that the culture destabilizes marriage when we tell people that an infidelity is a relationship extinction level event as opposed to something common, and that something that your relationship should be expected to survive.
Okay, here we have hit the precious common ground, because I completely agree. I just think that there's a big difference. I think that you can start from that premise and then say, you want to tell people that there's a good chance that over the course of decades, one partner is going to cheat, the other partner is going to cheat, things happen, and forgiveness has to be a hugely important part of marriage.
Forgiveness
what it seems to me is that you want to sort of, at least in some cases, sort of preempt forgiveness and say, well, in fact, there should be nothing to forgive because the spouse of 25 years told you going in that.
You're projecting. I am not saying that a non-monogamous model should be adapted by everyone. I'm not saying to the whole world forgiveness shouldn't be a problem.
But you're proposing a non-monogamous model to some fraction of Americans. Right?
I'm saying we have to acknowledge that there are Americans who have non-monogamous relationships, and the new word I've coined for it, because non-monogamous implies those key parties that you guys are always invoking. And swingers conventions in Las Vegas, like this idea that there are no non-monogamous, organized swinging heterosexual couples anymore, that went extinct in the 1970s, is horseshit, because it goes on and it's roaring now, in part thanks to the internet. And now I've lost my train of thought. But yeah, I'm not saying...
You're saying that these people exist, and they need within their sort of framework, they need moral structure too, and that my model of marriage doesn't supply.
No, but you're just
people who don't fit it with a moral structure.
You're projecting onto me this desire to impose on everyone one model, one size fits all, and I'm not.
Let's take it as given that in your preferred world, most. In fact, I think this is probably a distinction between us. I think that a more, let's say, Dan Savage-ified America would probably have more adultery. You think you would just be sort of helping people who are going to commit adultery anyway understand it and deal with it in a more productive way,
well, I wouldn't call it adultery if it was pre-negotiated.
Right, you'd call it sexual. You'd call it open. Yeah.
And in all I want in a Dan Savage-ified America, besides Rick Santorum run off the national stage forever, is
well, he's at 5% in the polls, so I think you're doing okay there.
Is an acknowledgement that monogamy as model doesn't work for all people, and that there are ways to ethically accommodate, a different kind of model of fidelity without destabilizing people who want monogamous relationships. I want people who want monogamous relationships to have monogamous relationships with people who also want monogamous relationships, and I want them to be realistic people in monogamous relationships about the likelihood of an infidelity and to process in advance what that will mean for their relationship. And I think it is particularly important when there are children involved, when a couple has children, that they not define an adultery and infidelity as a relationship extinction level event. It's not fair to the kids. The nightmare 70s divorce culture that conservatives invoke. I was scarred by that. When Sonny and Cher broke up, when Shields and Yarnell broke up, when the Captain and Tennille broke up, and then when my parents broke up. I was very traumatized by all that. I wish all those couples were all still together. And I think that when it comes to sex in relationships, in monogamous relationships, lifelong monogamous relationships, you guys put too much importance on sex. I'm the one who's accused of putting so much importance on sex. I think people should be allowed to have it with people who aren't their partners. But I think sex shouldn't be something that can explode a relationship, that can end a 25 or 30 year marriage. There are children involved, and the relationship really has transcended sex and become about a partnership and family and property and social position even. I'm kind of a social conservative when it comes to long-term relationships and what they mean. And I think they mean more than just nobody sees you naked ever again but me.
Well, right, but sex, look, one of the things about sex, and this is where I think the difference between gay relationships and straight relationships bears on this debate in certain ways, is that obviously sex isn't just a matter of seeing somebody else naked. It's a matter of performing a specific act or kinds of acts that, in certain circumstances, I think the older taboos and norms that you were sort of moderately nostalgic for, right? The sort of idea that men can go sow their wild oats with prostitutes and then come home and be good husbands to their wives and so on. That's a lot of that sort of those hypocrisies and double standards were built around the fact that women bear children and men don't, right? And those biological realities.
Let me interject really quickly. I'm not nostalgic for the double standard. I don't think that we need to return to an era when men had complete sexual freedom and license and women were sexually and socially enslaved in marriages. But please go on.
Okay, with that caveat, right? I guess what was I going to say? I was just going to say that. Do you think though that some of your understanding of this issue comes out of a sexual culture in which reproduction isn't an issue in the same way that it is straight?
If there's anything we know about gay sexual cultures over the last 30 years, it's basically consequence-free.
No, it's not. No. You're misunderstanding the argument. It isn't that sex is without consequences. It isn't that gay sex is without consequences. It's that the particular consequences within heterosexual families that are created by children, I think, and by the possibility of people having, if you have a family, so much straight adultery ends up with blended families and so on, and obviously gay adultery can end up with blended families too, but in a very different and less direct way, right?
Well, straight people have to worry about birth control, and over the last 30 years, gay people have had to worry about death control when it came to our sex lives and how we construct them. And I get it that birth control is hugely important, and that children matter, and an unplanned pregnancy is a potential consequence of heterosexual infidelity. And people still have infidelities. Straight people still cheat.
Right.
And straight people have access to birth control and condoms and morning after pills and abortion.
Right, and yet people still have, children with their mistresses and so on, right? I mean, like, the norms related to infidelity relate not only to issues of love and affection, but to issues of family formation, right?
And people have been having infidelities and children with their...
Right, but
let me finish. People have been doing what you're afraid people will start doing if I win the war, in a culture that said you're not allowed to do this. People have still been committing infidelities and having children with their side partners.
Sure, but can't you agree that in some cultures,
consequence we already have to live with?
But in some cultures, in some situations, they're likely to do more of it than in others, right? I mean, human sexual patterns aren't just fixed, and we're just sort of redescribing them. They change, surely.
Yeah, and? So the bedrock
of my argument, Dan, is just the idea that the norms that you set up for people when they enter into a public institution like marriage, and I think the whole push for gay marriage is premised on the idea that marriage isn't just a private institution, right? But that it is, in a sense, a public institution, and therefore the denial of it to gay couples matters. Affects their public standing, right? I mean, you agree that marriage isn't just whatever we make of it, right? Like you do think that it is a it's a good thing that there is this institution that is sort of publicly recognized in law.
Right. There are certain rights and responsibilities. There are rights that are the same couple to couple to couple, but every individual couple, beyond those rights and responsibilities and expectations, legally enforceable expectations, writes their own marriage vows, writes their own contract. And this is that sort of...
right, but we're just disagreeing on the scope of that contract, right? You're saying, let's remove... because right now... I'm not saying that. 98.5% of heterosexual couples, when they make their marriage vows, they are vowing lifelong fidelity. I'm sure there are couples who no doubt write the fidelity part out of the vows. But in general, right now, the current public understanding of marriage involves at least vows of fidelity. Wouldn't you agree?
That is an assumption and a cultural expectation that does not work for everyone, and not everyone is required to sign off on. And, when social conservatives only want to address this issue of the fungibility of that aspect of the marriage contract, this is only discussed when gay people want to get married. When straight people want to get married, nobody says to straight non-monogamous couples, you're not really married. Nobody said to Bill Clinton during Monica Gate, I guess we're going to have to forcibly divorce you. You're not really married.
No, but there's a difference between the heterosexual couple that undertakes vows, there's a difference between the heterosexual couple that undertakes vows and then breaks them, and the heterosexual couple that enters into marriage with an understanding that, essentially that with an open marriage, right? Like, I don't think that it's, I don't think that gay marriage is potentially a problem for the culture of marriage in America because gay people will cheat on each other. I think it might be a problem to the extent that it changes the public definition of marriage in the direction you're describing. It's not the fact of adultery; it's the attitude towards adultery that matters.
It's not changing the public definition of marriage. It's forcing straight people to acknowledge that they have already changed the public definition of marriage. That's what I think some of the overreaction from social conservatives is about. It's not opposition to gay marriage. It's not even necessarily the never-ending freak out about gay people and the crazy butt sex that they have. It's really forcing straight people to look at what straight people have done to redefine marriage to be over the last 60 years. And
I agree with that, but I think that redefinition, I think straight people have redefined marriage to be as you said before, to be an egalitarian institution that is primarily about about love rather than obligation, that is primarily about the couple involved rather than the larger family unit. I
love
don't
and
think
commitment, and beyond that, they get to define.
They get to define it, but I don't
themselves, and
right.
no one
But I
gets to
don't
tell
think
them
that
they're married or not married based on the decision they make about their sex life and what it's going to look like.
But I guess what I'd say, Dan, is that I think that while gay marriage, you're absolutely right that gay marriage is holding a mirror up to straights and saying this is gay marriage makes sense because of what you've already done with marriage. I completely agree with that. But I think what you're proposing is a further step, a sort of a public that heterosexual couples in general, that the public definition of marriage, it isn't just saying that this is about love and commitment more than about property and kids and so on. It's also saying it's more up for grabs how you define it sexually. I just think that's a change.
Okay, but I think maybe what I'm asking for that's a change is a little more honesty. That this is what's already happening. That people get to decide for themselves what sex is going to mean, what infidelity means, what adultery means, whether they're going to be monogamous or non-monogamous, whether they're going to be monogamish or non-monogamish. My new favorite word is monogamish because some of us who are
I read the was it Out that had the story?
I don't know.
Or no, The Advocate. I think it was The Advocate.
Some of us who are not monogamous chafe, especially when you're a gay male couple, and a gay male couple raising a child, as my partner and I are, and you say, well, we're not monogamous. People presume a degree of promiscuity that freaks me out, and I'm gay. So that's saying something. If you say you're not monogamous gay couple, people come over for dinner, they expect there's going to be a sling over your dining room table and a goat under it, and it's not true. There's just a little fun.
You've just destroyed all of my imaginings of the Savage household right there.
Well, the next time you're in Seattle, you come to dinner and we will hang a sling just for you.
Excellent. No, I appreciate it. I don't want my stereotypes destroyed, Dan. If you do that, there's nothing left.
What I want, my agenda is for a little bit more honesty and a little bit, of an acknowledgement of what's actually happening so that people can discuss. And I don't think that's destabilizing. You say that, introducing the idea that heterosexual marriage can be not monogamous, and then that's something that couple can agree to, negotiate, hash out, is going to explode marriage. How many examples of not monogamous heterosexual marriages do we need where we only recognize the non-monogamy in the explosion? Wouldn't it be stabilizing for straight people to meet some straight couples who've really diffused what for so many long-term couples is a ticking time bomb in the middle of their relationship, which is adultery and infidelity and what it means? And every day I get letters from crazy people who define infidelity as he looked at porn.
Yeah, no, I would define it. Maybe it depends on the porn and what you do with it.
You've got fundy Christians on your side of the aisle, far side. Far to the right of you who define masturbation in a relationship as infidelity. And I think we should have a conversation about infidelity and what it means, in part to stabilize long-term relationships. It's easy when you've been with somebody for 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years to say, we will always be strictly monogamous. Shit happens over the course of a lifetime. Some things become less important. Some things become more important. There are some ways in which you can demonstrate loyalty to a partner over the long haul that are more important. And I don't... And, out there in the weeds...
But you're on ground where we agree. I think that what I'm suggesting is that a model that mixes a certain amount of hypocrisy with a certain amount of forgiveness might actually be more stabilizing than a sort of...
And that's what I advocate.
But you're not advocating hypocrisy and forgiveness. You're advocating a situation... you're a big believer in forgiveness, but you're advocating a situation where people agree to ground rules in advance so that there is nothing to forgive.
I'm a big believer in social monogamy, being perceived to be socially monogamous versus sexually monogamous, I think, and that's a kind of hypocrisy that I can get behind. But no. I do believe that, so me and my husband, right, we were going to adopt a child, and we were monogamous for 6 or 7 years, 5, 6, 7 years at the start of our relationship. We were about to adopt a child, just a couple of years into our relationship. And my partner was Mr. Crazy Monogamy at the time, and I was fine with that. You should see him in a Speedo. Anybody can make a monogamous commitment to him. And it was really important to me that we come to terms that if somebody cheated, and in my experience with other boyfriends, it had been the one who was obsessed with monogamy was likelier to cheat first. It was really important to me that we have a conversation and hash out what will happen if one or the other of us cheats after we adopt this child. Because I didn't want to adopt with him if cheating was a breakup level.
Right, it was a breakup level issue.
Fair to the kid, right? That's the kind of honesty and conversation that I think all couples, gay and straight, monogamous or not, and we were monogamous at the time we were having that conversation, need to have. And I think that conversation is stabilizing of a relationship, particularly when there are children involved. And that's my agenda. My agenda isn't everybody should be non-monogamous.
Dan, to be clear, I'm not accusing you of advocating mass infidelity.
It's kind of what your column about Mark's piece implied.
No,
it should be the ice storm again. And
I think that there is you. I think that you have a certain amount of naivete about the way that social institutions work, and I think that I guess, and look, these are sort of unprovable assertions because you can't sort of draw direct social science connections one way or another. But it is my sense and sort of my reading of human history, if you will, that institutions tend to be stronger and tend to be more likely to channel people into paths that lead to what I think you and I both agree are, forms of human flourishing, right? Parents who stay together with their kids, right? Kids who grow up with both parents and not broken homes and so on. That institutions can do that work when they start out by actually making significant demands on people. And that when you, essentially what straights have done with marriage over the past 30 years, and I completely agree, the decline of marriage in the United States is a straight phenomenon that has very little to do with, with gay marriage and, the gay agenda or whatever you want to call it. But what straights have done to marriage is diminish the number of demands that it makes on straight couples. And as those demands have diminished, I think marriage as an institution, it both becomes weaker for the people involved, but more importantly, I think people are less likely to enter into the institution in the first place. And I know that that's, again, it's like, I mean, this is the connection that social conservatives always draw, right? And it's not a provable connection. You can't prove that the fact that 40% of kids are born out of wedlock is a consequence of straights treating marriage as being more about love and less about kids. But I tend to think that's true, and I think that those expectations have ripple effects. And I think that what you're describing, I guess it's the public aspect of it. It's not the fact that you're saying, well, people should have conversations about what would happen if one of us cheats, right? I agree. I think that those are conversations that married couples should have. And I mean, if you go through, in a conservative Catholic diocese in the United States, the premarital counseling, they'll tell you to have those conversations, which, maybe it's just a sign that Dan Savageism has penetrated even the citadels of the Catholic Church. But I think that that's a healthy thing. But there's a distinction between that and then saying...
I like to think I've penetrated the Catholic Church.
In many ways, yes. I should no more penetration remarks from me in this
conversation. I was an altar boy, so any
right, yes,
the Catholic Church
okay.
and penetration just sets off my joke-a-thon.
That's off your joke-a-thon. Well, but just, I mean, I guess it's just, you don't think that there are necessarily... I guess it seems to me when I read you, it seems like you think human beings have sexual patterns, and these sexual patterns are going to persist pretty much no matter what. And the question is, how honest do we want to be about those patterns for the sake of relationship stability? And I think there's a lot of truth to that, but it's also true that public expectations create sexual patterns. Bill Clinton, as much of a, lousy horn dog as he may be, is a different man because of the expectations in marriage than he might otherwise be. Like, 2,000 years ago, Bill Clinton would have had, he would have had a harem. Right? But this is, I guess this is the point. This is progress. The end of the harem, the end of polygamy. These things have been progress for human society and progress for gender equality. And I don't. Anyway, sorry, I'm rambling.
The old days that you pined for, when marriage was more commonplace, more lifelong, it was also still then marriage as enslavement, as the only way of advancement for women. I think we're seeing some of the consequences of the liberation of half of the human species. It's easy to say, oh, remember when marriage was for life back when women couldn't work and couldn't leave abusive husbands and didn't own their own children and could be raped with impunity and beaten with impunity by their husbands. Marriage was more stable when it was a slave-based economy, certainly. There's a certain price we may have to pay for a more egalitarian and free model of marriage, which includes not for everybody, and not everybody's going to wait or enter or stay in the institution in quite the same way that you would have them.
But see, I think to me, what you're describing is sort of the fallacy of the progressive, right? Which is saying that, because there were great evils in the past, we must therefore assume that every form of progress that it's sort of a one-way street. It's like, well, we think they did evil things in the past, so we can't learn anything from them either, right? I mean, I think, and maybe that's true, but what I'm arguing is that there were good things about marriage in 1955, and
going all the way back to the beginning. One of the good things about marriage in 1955 was it wasn't expected to be monogamous necessarily, and I think that model certainly worked better for men.
But it wasn't expected. But it wasn't expected to be monogamous in a somewhat different way from the way. I mean, first of all, I think you somewhat overstate the sort of the moral acceptability of male adultery in 1955. But I agree that it was more. I agree that it was more acceptable.
Have you read Marriage: A History by Stephanie Coontz?
I have, yes.
It's kind of amazing the letters men used to write back and forth with their brothers and brothers-in-law about seeing how prostitutes and how sort of unstigmatized that was. And prostitution then was a certain kind of slavery also, as one of the only options for women who weren't married or couldn't work. So I'm not pining for that system either. I want an egalitarian sexual economy for all.
But do you think that well, I mean, a couple things. It seems to me that, once you start drilling down into particular moral cases, that what you're describing is just as likely to end up with different forms of inegalitarianism. I mean, if you set up a situation where you have two people in a partnership and there's a sort of greater public accommodation of one or the other of them having sex with somebody else, almost inevitably the more powerful person in that relationship is the one who's going to end up taking advantage of it. And so to take the sort of extreme example you cited before, somebody has their sick spouse who, can't perform sexually and so on, and who is completely dependent on them, then they're placed in a position where, the other partner says, well, I'm happy to keep taking care of you, but by the way, I want to go and have sex with other people. And
that's a situation where I think that isn't said. There are times when I believe that people can, when cheating as opposed to negotiating, an allowance or an out, when cheating is the least worst option. We have a culture where that literally, I've had people say this on my blog, where somebody's in a situation exactly like that, wants to get their sexual needs met on the sly because their partner, who is incapable and has been incapable for 5 or 10 or 15 years of being sexual, would never give them permission to have sex with someone else. Mm-hmm. And it's not down to, oh, well, just suffer, bitch, suck it up, no sex for you for the next 30 years. It's down to, do I leave my partner or do I get my needs met and say nothing to my partner? And in a situation like that, option B, I think, is the least worst option. It's when you get into the weeds in relationships, into the gray areas and into the details, when accommodations sometimes have to be made and allowances sometimes have to be made for human failure and human needs. In the service
but I'm just saying, I think it's important to define those.
I
think it's important to define those failures as failures. Like when the person who you describe who presents you with the dilemma.
Did I not just say that was the least worst option? I'm defining it as a bad option.
No, but you're doing two things. First, you're saying this is the least worst option, but you're also saying that a better option would be for that couple to have successfully negotiated this prior to that, so that partner would give permission.
I'm not saying a better option. I'm saying that is also an option, and I think that people should discuss in advance. And what in that discussion you can say, this is never permissible. I will never sign off on this. In that discussion, you should state what it is that you want and require in a long-term relationship. So that discussion, in your mind, it seems that when I picture that discussion, I picture it always ending with, hey, anything goes, and here's your permission slip and your get out of adultery jail free card. And I don't think that's where those discussions always go.
No, but I think that what you're describing would tend to, you would end up with situations that were in a way a variant on sort of the lousy aspects of the old sort of male double standard, where it's sort of men were the stronger party in egalitarian marriages, and as the stronger party, they were the ones who tended to take liberties with the vows that they'd made. And I think that in a more egalitarian society, that's less likely to be it's less likely to just always be the men who are sort of, effectively bullying their spouses into living with adultery. But I think that the more you say this is not a norm that everybody needs to follow, the more likely you are to get in a situation where people feel sort of socially pressured to say yes to their, people want to keep their partners. People want to keep their boyfriends, their husbands, their lovers, their wives.
Males and females. But also people who may have a desire to have sex with someone else, they also want to keep their wives and girlfriends. There's another thing in my column, another phrase I toss around, which is the price of admission. And you pay the price of admission to be with someone. And I've told people frequently who wish to have sex with other people and their partners would never back off on it, that the price of admission to be with that person who values monogamy above all things is that you're not going to have sex with anybody else ever again. And if that's the price of admission you're willing to pay it and shut up and don't have sex with anybody else ever again. So that cuts both ways, that desire to be with somebody forever. I made a monogamous commitment once upon a time to my husband, even though monogamy wasn't my bag, because it mattered to him. And then that changed over the course of our relationship, and he changed it, not me. It wasn't imposed on him. But that was, I as a non-monogamist, monogamy was the price of admission I was willing to pay to be with him. So the sort of nightmare, oh my God, the more powerful position in the relationship is going to impose on the other, that can cut both ways.
Yes, it can. But I guess, and some of this comes down to, and I think again, this is where I don't know. I guess when I read you, I see sort of two perspectives on sex, right? One of which is the perspective that sex is, in a sense, a sort of uniquely uncontrollable desire. Not for everybody, but that, there are people who just, if they get into these situations where they, need to have sex and their partner is meeting their needs.
I would jump right in and say, sex, the act, is completely controllable. People make choices, and choices have moral dimensions and consequences. Desire is uniquely uncontrollable. You're going to wanna, and then after wanna, you have to think about should ya. And that, there's a lot of parsing that goes on in my column in Savage Love around should ya. And it doesn't always come down on the side of, yeah, you should.
Right. But why, I suppose in situations where people have, again, maybe they've built castles in their minds and so on and held out ideal versions of themselves and so on, but in situations where people take a particular set of vows and enter into the pursuit of a particular ideal, why is it so cruel for society to say, well, if you want to present yourself as part, because look, you keep saying,
you're idealizing sexual exclusivity over love, honesty, and commitment. And I don't think sexual exclusivity...
I'm not idealizing it over it, but I'm placing it on the same level, yes. And I'm saying I think it's hard...
I don't think lifelong sexual exclusivity belongs on the same level as lifelong commitment or love or honesty or joy in a relationship.
The joy is just a feeling. Lifelong sexual exclusivity is an actual, it's potentially an actual moral achievement. Isn't it a higher thing than just feeling joy?
A moral achievement? In what way?
Well, in the sense that it's something it's something that you strive for and attempt to achieve over impulses that you actually have. right? I mean, in terms just from a purely like human achievement perspective, not a sort of.
I would need a can opener and some thick black rubber gloves to unpack all the moral judgments in that statement.
What's wrong with? No, I'm making moral judgments, but Dan, you're making moral judgments too.
Well, no, you're
right?
saying that
you're just saying we can't make general moral judgments. We can only make specific moral judgments, and I'm saying no. There are general moral judgments like living up to very difficult vows that you make is almost always a very morally impressive thing. You're saying it's case by case by case.
And I'm saying, but implicit in that statement is somehow that I'm not living up to the vows and the commitments that I've made to my partner. That people who
I think that if you entered into your
people in monogamous relationships, our commitments and our sex life and our love as expressed is somehow less of an achievement, less valuable, and less loving than somebody who's in a lifelong monogamous relationship and their achievement.
I think it's certainly I think it's certainly less of an achievement and is quite possibly.
Really? I disagree. I disagree.
I think don't you think that you can express love through sacrifice in general, not specifically with sex, but that sacrifice can be an expression of love.
Who says that in a monogamish relationship there's no sacrifice?
Nobody's saying there's no sacrifice. I'm talking about
even on the sexual front.
Right, but I'm not saying that there's no. I'm not saying that there's some binary here where the monogamous relationship is flawless and fantastic, and the monogamish relationship, I can imagine a monogamish relationship that is infinitely morally superior in most ways to an abusive or an unpleasant monogamous relationship. I'm just saying that on the specific question of sexual exclusivity, I think the couple that successfully sacrifices some of their desires in order to maintain that exclusivity has done something that's a little more morally impressive than the couple that doesn't make that sacrifice.
I disagree.
But why?
Disagree.
But why? I mean, what if it were money? What if we were talking about money, right? Like rich couples, poor couples, couples that both work, there are all kinds of couples. But a couple that where both parties give up some financial remuneration in order to spend more time with their children. That couple has done something more morally impressive in a sense than a couple that just pursues pursues greater financial gain potentially.
But the presumption here is that there is no sacrifice and there is no givingness or monogamish relationship.
No, that's not the assumption.
Well, you're saying that your sacrifice is more morally impressive. What of the sacrifice?
I think that it is more morally impressive to be sexually exclusive than to sleep with, say, 5 people, one every 4 years over the course of your marriage.
What of the sacrifice of the ill partner in that situation that we discussed, saying to their partner, as much as it pains me, I think you should get your needs met because I don't want you to be denied the joys and release of sexual intimacy for the rest of your life because I'm ill. And so you go. No,
you're right. That's true. You could imagine. I agree. You could imagine a scenario where one partner sacrifices a certain. You're right. There are different.
Because I'm not trying to set up a binary here. Relationships and people who believe everyone should be monogamous or just defer to the monogamous expectation as an ideal. There's this idea that monogamishness is all about. Squalid desires and selfishness and, sort of a kind of sexual gluttony. And that's not true. There are people in relationships, and I deal with this...
I think it's more like a kind of sexual gourmand. It's not like the Hardee's thick burger.
Here's a real situation that comes up all the time. You have a couple. They love each other. They are married. They have children. They, are great partners, whatever. The husband or the wife, and it's not always the husbands who are dogs, the husband has a kink, a need. And it's easy for people who don't have a kink to say, just live without it, and, because you don't have that kink. So say he has a foot fetish. Say his wife hates it, doesn't like it, doesn't like him to touch her feet, isn't kinky, can't even, just stick her foot out and think of England while he does his business, right? And she says to him, just go see a pro dom. And get that need met. And stop asking me about it, because it just squicks me out and I need to suspend my disbelief and pretend you don't have this fetish. what isn't sacrificing about that act? What isn't loving about that? About her looking at him and saying, I can recognize how important this sexual act this is to you. Even though, I would rather be in a strictly monogamous relationship, even though I think we could make better use of the $200 an hour that you're going to spend every 6 months or once a year on a pro-dom foot fetish specialist. But please go do it because I value your sexual fulfillment, because I want you to be happy.
Right.
What isn't loving about that? What isn't as moral a victory in that exchange as the moral victory of, locking his dick up for the rest of his life?
So a couple things. One is that I think that it's possible to make judgments that, a few things. One, again, marriages are entered into with, and I agree with you, they're entered into perhaps with fewer conversations than should be had, right? But they're entered into with vows and expectations and so on. And from the point of view
define and determine for themselves.
From the point of view of the marriage vows, the guy who breaks those vows by going to the dominatrix to get his foot fetish managed is doing something less impressive than the guy who locks his dick up, right?
This is just from the perspective of the vow. I wasn't talking about him. I was talking about her.
You're talking about her, right?
What's morally impressive about her in that situation?
Right. So what you just described is somebody who has a certain desire for, a certain understanding of what their marriage should be, has made the same vows as their husband and is trying to live up to them, and feels that he can't live up to his vows, and therefore she needs to give him permission to live up to his vows. And yes, in a sense, this is, I agree, you can make a case that this is an act of great self-sacrificial love. But I guess it's just, Dan, I think it's a sadder and more squalid and more depressing form of self-sacrifice than the guy who figures out how to live with not getting his rocks off, over his foot fetish. And there it is a value judgment, and I'm not going to be able to prove it to you. You're right. Some of this comes down to a sort of
sex matters, desire matters, and can really destabilize a long-term relationship. And the unfulfilled desire is the rock in the shoe. And it's easy for people who don't have a particular kink or fetish to discount its importance or how much of a distraction and an obsession it can become, and how much resentment can build up over a lifetime of self-denial. And people will then begin to look at their partners as the source of that frustration. And that, I think, is destabilizing. And I would encourage women who are with men or men who are with women, it's not all one way,
right?
Gender-wise, that it's better to pack the hubby off to see the dominatrix than to expect the hubby to go without all his life. Because what's going to happen is a divorce is ultimately going to happen in a situation like that. Certainly an infidelity is going to happen, and potentially a divorce. And I think that is the least, the most worst option.
Well,
I think people should be accommodating of their lovers and their needs, even sometimes recognizing when there's a need that they can't meet.
And I agree, but I think that there's a distinction. I think that the argument that I wish you were making as a sex columnist in that scenario is to the woman to let her husband stroke her feet. That is part of, in a sense, what she signed. That's
where I start. That's where I begin.
Right, but this is what she has. In a sense, this is the flip side, right? This is what she's. In my conception of marriage, both partners are signing up for a partnership, where they have to take, within reason, their partner's kinks into account.
Would you put it the way I put it? You got to be whores for each other.
I wouldn't put it the way. No, I wouldn't.
Long-term exclusive sexual relationship.
I think I have a copy
You're
of Pope
signing
John
up to
Paul's
be-
Theology of the Body here somehow that puts that in slightly different terminology, Dan.
You gotta be whores for each other. You can, lifelong sexual exclusivity imposes demands, I think, on both partners. Sacrifice on the partner who may prefer to be not monogamous. If they make a long-term monogamous commitment, they have to sacrifice. And that also places an obligation on both partners to meet the other's needs. And that usually doesn't come out in conversations about sex.
I'm glad we've reached this point, because I think it's important, and I think that the model of marriage that I'm describing depends on that recognition no less than, I mean, this is why, in the sort of in the Catholic Church, failure to consummate a marriage is grounds not for divorce but for annulment, because that kind of mutuality is part of the definition of what a marriage is.
But once you recognize that, a marriage and, that kind of commitment imposes an obligation to meet each other's needs, what do you do with the unmeetable need? What do you do with needs that you can't meet because you are incapable or unwilling?
I think that the answer to the unmeetable need is either repression or hypocrisy.
Well, I'm not necessarily against hypocrisy. Like I said, I'm for a lot of couples who are monogamous are
right, but
invested
you're much
in being
more
perceived
against
socially as monogamous,
right.
And I'm for social perceptions of monogamy. We have.
But you're much more against
have,
repression than I am. I think, and which wouldn't be surprising given that I'm the social conservative and you're the
I am much more against
crazy sodomite,
in
right?
part because. Thank you for that. Yeah. I'm much more against repression in part because that repression destabilizes relationships. In part because that will light a fuse that will explode the relationship.
Right, but I guess it's just, Dan, I think that it's sort of 6 of one, half a dozen of the other half the time, whether repression or expression actually destabilizes.
Expression has to be harnessed.
But once you've conceded, you're like, well, we're going to harness this repression. We're going to write all these rules, this expression. We're going to write all these rules around it. You're halfway to repression anyway. Why not go all the way? If you're only having sex with one foot fetishist once every 2.5 years on alternate Thursdays, just come all the way to monogamy. Come on,
Why should people
because the nature of human excellence is depending. That sounds absurd, but the nature of human excellence depends on overcoming overcoming impulses for the sake of your partner, your children, the people you love, and managing them is
I knew at some point I'd be able to toss out the definition of Puritanism, the fear that someone somewhere is enjoying himself. Why should that person have to go without that pleasure all his life for your comfort? If it's fine with him and it's fine with his wife, why?
Well, and this is, and we're, and I know you.
Why shouldn't we celebrate?
Well, these are two separate questions, and I know you have to go, but let me just. This will be the last thing I say. You've spent a lot of time saying you don't think, you're not trying to create a model for everyone in the United States. I'm saying that I don't think that the conservative model of marriage is necessarily for everybody, and I'm not saying that that it would be a better country if we foot fetishists could never have their fetishes stroked and whatever. But there's a difference between saying that yes, America is always going to be filled with people doing all kinds of things sexually, but the point of marriage is to create a particular model. And that's where I think you and I just disagree. I think that there is value in a particular model of...
And you wonder why fewer people wish to enter this institution when it is defined as the end of sexual adventure, the end of pleasure, and the imposition.
And this is where I think you're crazy. Limits. I think that more people want to enter an institution that makes stronger demands of people. But your definition of marriage right now is triumphant. So why are marriage rates? My definition of marriage, as you yourself just said, has been collapsing for 40 years. Right?
But particularly in places where more people agree with you about the definition of marriage, marriage is less prevalent and less stable.
Not in Utah. It's doing okay in Utah.
How's it doing in the Palin family?
The Palins. I mean, they're good kids. No, but look, you have to. We're afternoon your time, so I don't.
Yeah, I gotta run.
All right. Well, listen. This has been a lot of fun, and we'll have to do it again in 5 years and see how the gay marriage experiment is working out for for straight America or
It
something.
seems to be working fine for straight Canadians.
Straight Canadians, yes.
So does socialized medicine. Works just fine up there. You can have socialized medicine and gay marriage.
And gay marriage. No, I know. That's why if I get too
socialized-
close to the Canadian border, my feet catch on fire, and I have to.
I want socialized gay marriage. I want to have a big gay wedding, and I want the government to pay for it.
Well, we're well on our way, so I'm looking forward to it too. All right, good talking to you, Dan.
You too.